Liam lived in solitude, wrapped in an unbearable cloak of grief that clung to him like the cold mountain air surrounding his remote cabin. His wife, Alice, and their daughter, Sophie, had been gone for 2 years, taken by a tragic accident that felt as though it had ripped out his very heart. Since their deaths, Liam had retreated from the world, seeking solace in isolation, a futile attempt to mend his shattered spirit amidst the raw beauty of the wilderness. The cabin was a modest structure, nestled deep in the woods where towering pines whispered secrets to one another, and the call of distant birds was the only interruption in the otherwise silent days. To anyone else, it might have been a tranquil escape. For Liam, it was a prison of his own making. Every corner, every creak of the wooden floorboards seemed to hold a memory of the life he had lost. The photographs adorning the fireplace mantel haunted him most. There was Sophie, her smile wide and innocent, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. Next to her was Alice, her gentle laugh forever frozen in time. Some days, Liam would sit in his worn armchair for hours, staring at those images, feeling a pang of guilt for still breathing when they no longer could. Liam's profession as a nature photographer had once been his greatest joy, a passion he had shared with Alice. She had been his partner in every sense of the word, joining him on expeditions, helping him compose shots, and filling their days with shared laughter and discovery. Now, the camera felt like a relic of a former life. It sat untouched on a dusty table, its once well-used strap now brittle and cracked. The forests surrounding the cabin were both a balm and a torment. They were Alice's favorite place, a sanctuary where she taught Sophie to chase butterflies and climb trees. Now, those same woods echoed with their absence. Liam could barely step outside without feeling the oppressive weight of their loss. Even the crisp scent of pine needles seemed like a cruel reminder of the love and laughter he would never experience again. At night, the silence grew deafening. Without Alice's soft breathing beside him, without Sophie's occasional midnight giggles or murmured dreams, the cabin felt lifeless. The bed, a shared refuge during their marriage, was too large now. Liam often slept curled up on the couch, as if the smaller space could shield him from the vast emptiness that had consumed his life. Liam's days were a series of half-hearted routines. He chopped wood, fetched water from the creek, and cooked simple meals he could barely bring himself to eat. The act of survival seemed absurd in the face of his pain, but it was all he had. The neighbors in the nearest town, 20 miles away, occasionally sent supplies, leaving them on his doorstep when he refused to answer their knocks. They whispered about him, the broken man in the woods, but Liam didn't care. People and their pity had no place in his world anymore. Yet, there were times when the loneliness was unbearable, cutting through him like a knife. The ache wasn't just emotional. It was physical, an all-consuming void that gnawed at him relentlessly. He would sit on the porch for hours, gazing into the horizon, silently begging for some kind of sign, a whisper from the heavens, a gust of wind that felt like Alice's touch. But the universe remained cruelly indifferent. The little belongings Alice and Sophie had left behind were sacred artifacts in his sanctuary of grief. Sophie's tiny shoes still sat by the door, scuffed from countless adventures in the woods. Alice's favorite scarf hung on the coat rack, its faded fabric still faintly scented with her perfume. Liam couldn't bear to move them. Doing so felt like erasing the last traces of their existence. And so, the seasons changed around him, each one carrying its own brand of torment. Spring's blossoms reminded him of Sophie's laughter. Summer's warmth felt hollow without Alice by his side. The brilliant colors of autumn leaves mocked his desolation, and winter's biting chill mirrored the frozen wasteland of his heart. Life went on around him, but Liam remained suspended in time, trapped in the moment his world had ended. Sometimes, Liam tried to make sense of it all. Was it fate, some cruel cosmic plan, or just a random act of misfortune? He replayed the day of the accident over and over in his mind, dissecting every moment, every decision, searching for a way he could have saved them. It was a futile exercise, but he couldn't stop. The guilt weighed on him like a boulder, crushing any semblance of peace he might have found. On rare occasions, Liam ventured out with his camera, not out of passion but obligation. Photography had been his livelihood, and the dwindling savings from Alice's life insurance wouldn't last forever. But the act of capturing beauty felt like a betrayal. How could he immortalize the world's wonders when his own had been so cruelly taken from him? Each shutter click felt hollow, a cruel mockery of the joy it once brought him. The photographs he did manage to take were dark and brooding. Stark landscapes, gnarled trees silhouetted against stormy skies, and frozen streams that mirrored his own sense of stagnation. Even these images went largely unpublished, sitting forgotten on his hard drive, just another casualty of his grief. Liam rarely spoke aloud anymore. His voice felt foreign to him, as if it belonged to someone else. When he did break his silence, it was usually to talk to Alice and Sophie. At first, he had whispered their names, convinced they were still there, just out of reach. But as time passed, the words became bitter, angry outbursts directed at the void. How could they leave him? How could the world go on as if they had never existed? And yet, deep down, a small part of Liam knew he couldn't stay in this limbo forever. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when he felt the stirrings of something else. Not hope, exactly, but the faintest glimmer of the man he used to be. Maybe it was a memory of Alice's laughter, or a vision of Sophie chasing fireflies. But something within him whispered that they wouldn't want this for him. They had loved life, and they had loved him. Maybe, just maybe, they would want him to find a way to live again. For now, though, Liam remained in his self-imposed exile, tethered to his grief, his pain, and the ghosts of the family he had lost. The cabin stood as both a refuge and a tomb, a testament to a love that had once filled it with warmth and now left it cold and empty. The snowstorm had rolled in suddenly, blanketing the forest in thick, swirling white. Liam, seated by the fire in his cabin, stared into the flames, lost in the flickering dance of orange and yellow. Outside, the wind howled like a chorus of mournful ghosts. It wasn't unusual for the weather to turn vicious during the winter, but tonight the storm felt alive, as though it were trying to claw its way through the wooden walls and pull him into its frozen grip. He had spent the day chopping wood, stacking the logs methodically beside the cabin. It was a task he had done 100 times before, though now it served more as a way to exhaust himself than anything else. Physical fatigue was easier to bear than the relentless weight of his grief. By the time the first flakes of snow began to fall, he had retreated inside, sealing himself in for what he expected to be another long, silent night. The knock came just after midnight. At first, Liam thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, a loose branch scraping against the side of the cabin. But then it came again, a low, deliberate thud against the door. He froze in his chair, heart hammering in his chest. No one came here, not in the middle of a snowstorm. Not ever. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his muscles stiff and reluctant after hours of sitting. He grabbed the hunting knife from the kitchen counter, its blade gleaming faintly in the firelight, and approached the door. His breath caught in his throat as he turned the handle, the sound of the latch clicking unnervingly loud in the stillness. What he saw on the other side of the door made him stagger back in shock. A bear. It wasn't like the ones he had seen during his years photographing wildlife. Majestic and powerful, striding through the woods with unshakable confidence. This bear was different. Its fur was matted with blood and snow, patches missing entirely to reveal raw, jagged wounds. Its eyes, glassy and wild, met Liam's for a brief moment before it collapsed onto the snow-covered porch with a low, pained growl. Liam stood frozen, the knife trembling in his hand. His instinct screamed at him to slam the door and lock it, to retreat to the relative safety of the cabin. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the bear had looked at him, not with the predatory gaze of a beast, but with the desperate plea of a creature on the brink of death. Or maybe it was the faint echo of Alice's voice in his mind, reminding him of her love for all living things, no matter how dangerous. He took a tentative step forward, the knife still clutched in his hand. The bear didn't move. Its breaths came in shallow, labored bursts, each one a struggle. The snow around it was rapidly turning crimson, and Liam realized with a jolt that it wouldn't survive the night without help. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, sheathing the knife. Against every shred of common sense, he crouched beside the bear, his hands trembling as he examined the wounds. They were deep, likely caused by a fight with another animal, or perhaps hunters. Liam's fingers brushed against the bear's fur, and he felt its body flinch beneath his touch. He spoke softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, the bear or himself. It took all his strength to drag the massive creature inside. The bear groaned in protest as Liam heaved its weight over the threshold, but it was too weak to resist. Once inside, he closed the door and bolted it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cabin suddenly felt oppressively small, the presence of the injured animal filling the space with a primal, suffocating energy. He grabbed a pile of old blankets from the bedroom and spread them on the floor by the fire. The bear collapsed onto them with a heavy thud, its sides rising and falling unevenly. Liam hesitated, unsure of what to do next. He had no experience treating an animal this size, and the thought of getting close enough to tend to its wounds made his stomach churn with fear. But there was no one else. No one to call for help. No one to share the burden. Just like always. Gritting his teeth, Liam fetched a bowl of warm water and a clean rag. As he knelt beside the bear, his mind raced with doubts and fears. One wrong move, and its massive claws could tear him apart in an instant. Yet as he began cleaning the wounds, the bear remained still, its eyes half closed as though it understood that Liam was trying to help. The work was slow and grueling. The wounds were worse than he had initially thought, and each time he pressed the rag against them, the bear let out a low, rumbling growl that sent shivers down his spine. His hands were slick with blood, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as he fought to keep his composure. Hours passed, the storm outside raging on. By the time Liam finished, he was exhausted, his body aching from the effort. He sat back on his heels, staring at the bear as it lay motionless by the fire. For a moment, he thought it might have died, but then its chest rose in a slow, steady rhythm. Liam felt an unexpected surge of relief. He had done something. He had saved something. It wasn't much, and it didn't erase the emptiness that consumed him, but it was something. As dawn broke, the storm began to subside, the howling winds giving way to an eerie stillness. Liam sat by the fire, his head resting in his hands. The bear remained where it was, its breathing now steady and even. For the first time in years, Liam felt the faintest flicker of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't happiness or even hope, but it was enough to keep him going for now. The storm had passed, leaving the forest blanketed in a thick, untouched layer of snow. Sunlight refracted off the frozen landscape, creating an almost blinding brightness that seemed at odds with the cold, desolate silence. Inside the cabin, Liam sat beside the bear, its breathing deep and steady now, a sign that it was recovering. He stared at the animal, still trying to comprehend how he had spent the previous night tending to such a dangerous creature. Liam's body ached from the effort, but the faint sense of purpose he had felt earlier lingered. The bear, for all its size and power, looked vulnerable now, its wounds partially bandaged with scraps of fabric and Liam's old shirts. Yet something about the animal's behavior gnawed at him. Its eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, seemed restless. Every so often, it let out a low, mournful sound, as if calling to something or someone. That's when it struck him. The bear wasn't just injured and lost. It was looking for something. For family. The realization hit Liam like a fist to the chest, leaving him breathless. He couldn't ignore it, not after everything he had already done. If this bear had cubs, if they were alone in this unforgiving cold, they wouldn't survive long. He looked at the massive creature lying on his floor and sighed. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. The thought of venturing out into the forest after a storm like that was insanity. The snow would be deep, the terrain treacherous. But the idea of doing nothing, of leaving those cubs to freeze, was unbearable. He had already come this far. If he stopped now, It would be as if all his effort was for nothing. Bundling himself up in every layer he could find, Liam strapped on his old snowshoes, grabbed a heavy walking stick, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall, seeping through his clothes almost immediately. The snow crunched underfoot as he trudged forward, the dense forest towering above him in every direction. He had no idea where to start, but he hoped the bear's tracks from the previous night might lead him to the cubs. The trail was faint, partially obscured by fresh snowfall, but it was there. Liam followed it with dogged determination, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The forest felt eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of his snowshoes and the occasional creak of branches under the weight of the snow. Every step was a struggle, the snow threatening to pull him down with each movement. After what felt like hours, Liam saw something ahead, a dark opening in the side of a hill, partially hidden by a cluster of trees. A cave. His pulse quickened as he approached, each step sending a mixture of hope and dread coursing through him. If the cubs were in there, they could be alive, but they could just as easily be dead, frozen in the icy grip of the storm. Liam ducked his head and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air was slightly warmer here, insulated by the thick rock walls. He scanned the cave, his breath catching when he spotted movement in the far corner. Two tiny shapes huddled together, their fur dusted with frost. The bear cubs. They were barely moving, their bodies pressed so tightly together it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Liam hesitated, fear prickling at the edges of his mind. These were wild animals, and even as young as they were, they could still be dangerous if they felt threatened. But as he inched closer, he saw the same desperation in their eyes that he had seen in their mothers. They were too cold, too weak to resist. "It's okay," Liam whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm here to help." Slowly, he unwrapped the scarf from around his neck and placed it over the cubs. Their tiny bodies flinched at the touch, but they didn't move away. He carefully scooped them up, cradling them against his chest. They were lighter than he had expected, their frailty tugging at something deep inside him. As he turned to leave the cave, one of them let out a weak, pitiful cry that echoed through the stillness. The trek back to the cabin was even harder than the journey out. The added weight of the cubs, combined with his own exhaustion, made every step feel like a monumental effort. Liam's legs burned, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The wind had picked up again, biting at his exposed skin and making it nearly impossible to see. But he pushed on, driven by the knowledge that these cubs had no one else. By the time he reached the cabin, Liam was on the verge of collapse. He stumbled inside, kicking the door shut behind him and sinking to the floor. The bear lifted its head, letting out a low, rumbling growl that quickly softened into something almost relieved. The cubs squirmed weakly in Liam's arms, their cries growing louder as they caught sight of their mother. Carefully, Liam set the cubs down on the blankets beside the bear. They crawled toward her, their tiny bodies trembling with effort. The mother bear nosed them gently, her massive frame curling protectively around them. Watching them reunite, Liam felt a lump rise in his throat. He turned away, giving them what little privacy he could in the cramped cabin. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and care. Liam divided his time between feeding the fire, fetching water, and doing his best to keep the bears comfortable. He scavenged his dwindling supplies for anything that could help: old blankets, scraps of food, even a pot of warm water to heat the cabin further. The cubs gained strength little by little, their cries growing louder, more insistent. But the presence of the bears also brought new challenges. The cabin, already small, felt impossibly cramped with the three of them inside. The mother bear, though calmer now, still watched Liam with wary eyes, a low growl rumbling in her chest whenever he got too close to her cubs. And then there was the smell, a pungent, overwhelming musk that no amount of fresh air could clear. Liam endured it all without complaint, though the isolation began to weigh on him more heavily than ever. The bears were a constant reminder of how empty his life had become, their reunion only highlighting the loss of his own family. At night, as he lay on the couch listening to the sounds of the bears breathing, he couldn't stop the memories from flooding back, Alice's laughter, Sophie's tiny hand slipping into his as they walked through these same woods. It was a cruel twist of fate, he thought, that he could save this family but not his own. Yet as the days passed, he found himself speaking to the bears, sharing his thoughts aloud as though they could understand him. It was absurd, he knew, but it was the first time in years that he had spoken without the weight of silence pressing down on him. And though the bears couldn't respond, their presence was strangely comforting. For the first time since Alice and Sophie's death, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The days turned into weeks as the bears slowly regained their strength in the cramped warmth of the cabin. The mother bear, though still watchful and cautious, began to trust Liam, or at least tolerate his presence. Her growls became less frequent, her eyes less sharp, as if she understood he wasn't a threat to her or her cubs. The cubs, on the other hand, grew bolder with each passing day, exploring the corners of the cabin with clumsy curiosity, their soft paws padding over the wooden floor. Liam, who had spent years buried under the weight of his grief, found himself falling into a new routine, one that revolved entirely around the bears. His mornings were spent stoking the fire, ensuring the cabin stayed warm for them. He ventured outside in the bitter cold to gather food, hunting small game or scavenging berries and nuts from his dwindling supplies. It wasn't ideal, but it kept them all alive. At first, he treated the tasks as a way to fill the endless hours, an extension of the numb routines that had defined his life since Alice and Sophie's deaths. But as the days passed, he noticed a shift within himself. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was caring. Every time the cubs nuzzled against their mother or let out small, playful growls, a faint warmth stirred in Liam's chest. It was unfamiliar and unsettling, but he didn't push it away. The cabin, once a place of suffocating silence, now hummed with life. The cubs' playful squeaks and the mother bear's low rumbles replaced the emptiness that had haunted him for years. Liam spoke to them often, his voice hoarse from disuse at first. He told them about Alice and Sophie, about the hikes they used to take through these very woods. He spoke about how Sophie had once insisted on bringing home a frog she'd found by the creek, and how Alice had spent an hour convincing her that the frog needed to stay in its natural habitat. The bears, of course, didn't understand a word, but they listened in their own way. The mother bear would tilt her head slightly, her dark eyes fixed on Liam as if she could sense the sorrow beneath his words. The cubs, oblivious to the pain in his voice, would clamber over his legs or paw at his boots, their playful energy a stark contrast to his heavy heart. Despite the growing bond, there were still moments of tension, moments when the fragile trust between man and beast threatened to shatter. One afternoon, as Liam was cleaning up the remains of a small rabbit he'd managed to snare, the mother bear suddenly let out a deep, guttural growl. He froze, the knife slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. She was on her feet in an instant, her massive frame towering over him, her eyes blazing with primal fury. It took Liam a moment to realize what had set her off. One of the cubs had wandered too close to the knife, its tiny nose sniffing curiously at the blade. The sight of her vulnerable cub, near something so dangerous, had triggered an instinctive reaction. Slowly, Liam raised his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. "I wasn't going to hurt him," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I never hurt them. You know that?" The bear stared at him for what felt like an eternity before finally lowering herself back down to the floor. Liam let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he retrieved the knife and moved it out of reach. It was a sobering reminder of how precarious their situation was, how easily trust could be broken. As the weeks went by, the bond between Liam and the bears deepened. The cubs, who had been timid and frail when he first brought them to the cabin, were now full of energy, tumbling over each other in playful mock fights. They had taken to following Liam around the cabin, their tiny paws slipping on the wooden floor as they tried to keep up. He couldn't help but smile at their antics, their joy infectious in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The mother bear, too, had softened. She still kept a wary eye on Liam, but there were moments when he caught her watching him with what almost seemed like gratitude. One evening, as the cub slept curled up beside her, She lifted her massive head and let out a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't a growl or a warning. It was something softer, almost like a sigh. Liam, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands, looked up and met her gaze. For the first time, he felt a flicker of connection, a sense that they weren't so different after all. But with the connection came vulnerability. As the bears thrived, Liam began to confront the emotions he had spent years suppressing. The sight of the cubs playing with abandon, their lives so full of potential, brought back memories of Sophie, memories he had tried to bury. He saw her in their clumsiness, in the way they pounced on each other with pure, unfiltered joy. And with those memories came the guilt, the unbearable weight of knowing he had failed to protect his own family. One night, as the bears slept by the fire, Liam sat alone at the kitchen table, his hands gripping the edges of the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. The cabin was quiet again, but this time, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt expectant, as if waiting for him to confront the storm inside him. "I couldn't save them," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I tried, but it wasn't enough. It's never enough." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For the first time in years, Liam allowed himself to cry. The tears came in silent waves, streaking down his face as he sat in the dim light of the fire. He didn't try to stop them. He let the grief wash over him, let it consume him, until there was nothing left but the faint flicker of relief that came from finally letting go. When he finally lifted his head, the mother bear was watching him. Her dark eyes, filled with an almost eerie understanding, met his. She didn't move, didn't growl. She just watched, her presence grounding him in a way he couldn't explain. From that night on, something shifted in Liam. He began to see the bears not just as creatures in his care, but as something more, a second chance, a way to find purpose in a world that had seemed devoid of it. He still carried the weight of his loss, but it no longer felt as suffocating. The bears needed him, and for the first time in years, he felt capable of giving something of himself. As winter began to wane and the first hints of spring crept into the forest, Liam knew the time would come soon when the bears would leave. The thought filled him with a bittersweet ache. He wasn't ready to let them go, but he knew he couldn't keep them. They belonged to the wild, to the freedom of the forest. And perhaps in some way so did he. The thaw of spring began with subtle signs. A slow drip of melting snow from the roof of the cabin, a faint warmth that seeped through the once bitter winds, and the earliest hints of green peeking through the frozen ground. Inside the cabin, the bears were now fully healed. The mother bear's coat had regained its luster. The wounds Liam had painstakingly cleaned and treated now only faint scars. The cubs, once frail and trembling, had grown robust and fearless, their playful energy transforming the small cabin into a chaotic den of activity. But with their recovery came an undeniable truth. The bears no longer belonged here. The cabin, a haven during the brutal winter, was not their home. They needed to return to the forest, to the life they were meant to live. Liam knew this as much as he knew the sun would rise and set, but the knowledge didn't make the prospect any easier to bear. He spent days avoiding the inevitable, convincing himself that the bears still needed him, that the cubs weren't ready to face the wilderness. Yet every time he saw the mother bear pacing near the door, her powerful body restless and her eyes fixed longingly on the forest outside, he knew he was lying to himself. She was ready, and so were her cubs. It was Liam who wasn't. The cabin felt alive now in a way it hadn't for years. The cubs' mischief had filled the void left by Sophie's absence, their curious sniffs and playful growls echoing through the space. The mother bear, for all her wildness, had become a silent companion, her presence grounding and constant. Letting them go felt like opening a wound he had only just begun to heal. One morning, as the sun climbed higher into the sky, Liam stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the endless expanse of trees. He had taken to walking there daily, testing himself, preparing for what he knew was coming. He gripped the walking stick in his hand, the rough wood splintering slightly under his tightening grip. His breaths came in slow, deliberate gulps, each one heavy with the weight of decision. The bears followed him to the edge of the forest that afternoon, the mother walking with deliberate purpose while the cubs tumbled after her. Liam glanced back at the cabin, its familiar outline stark against the brightness of the day. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of two worlds, the safe, suffocating past and the untamed, uncertain future. He crouched in front of the cubs, who had grown accustomed to his presence, and now treated him with the same playful curiosity they showed their mother. One of them pawed at his boot, its tiny claws snagging on the worn leather. Liam smiled faintly, his hand reaching out to ruffle the soft fur on its head. "You've got to be brave out there," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "No one's going to take care of you the way she does." He nodded toward the mother bear, who was watching him with those same dark, knowing eyes. She let out a low huff, the sound almost impatient, as if urging him to stop stalling. The cub squeaked in response, toddling over to her side. Liam straightened, his body stiff with the effort of holding himself together. He couldn't cry now, not in front of them, not when this was the right thing to do. It took every ounce of willpower to lift the latch on the gate and step aside, giving the bears a clear path into the forest. For a moment, none of them moved. The mother bear turned her head, her gaze lingering on Liam as if waiting for his permission, or perhaps his goodbye. The connection between them was wordless but profound, a bond forged in survival and trust. "Go," he said softly. "You don't belong here anymore." The mother bear seemed to understand. She nudged the cubs forward with her massive head, her movements gentle but firm. The cubs hesitated, glancing back at Liam with wide, curious eyes, before bounding after their mother. The sight of their tiny forms disappearing into the trees was almost too much for him to bear. He clenched his fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he forced himself to stay rooted in place. And then they were gone. The forest swallowed them whole, their departure as silent as the snow falling in winter. Liam stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where they had vanished, as if willing them to reappear. The air felt heavier, the quiet of the forest pressing against him like a physical weight. For the first time in months, the cabin felt empty again. The days that followed were some of the hardest Liam had faced since Alice and Sophie's deaths. The absence of the bears was a constant ache, a reminder of the fragile purpose they had given him. He found himself listening for the cubs' playful squeaks, glancing toward the door whenever he heard a creak in the wood. The silence that once suffocated him now felt unbearable, an oppressive void that threatened to swallow him whole. But alongside the sadness, there was something else, a faint glimmer of pride. He had saved them. He had given them a chance to survive, to live the life they were meant to live. That mattered. It didn't erase the pain of losing them, but it gave him a sense of meaning he hadn't felt in years. Liam threw himself into work, repairing the cabin and preparing for the changing seasons. He ventured deeper into the forest than he had in years, his camera slung over his shoulder as he captured the thawing beauty of spring. Each step felt like a reclamation, a small victory over the grief that had once paralyzed him. One day, as he hiked near the spot where he had found the mother bear, he noticed something in the distance. It was faint, a rustling in the underbrush, followed by a low, familiar sound. Liam froze, his heart pounding as he scanned the trees. And then he saw them. The mother bear stood at the edge of a clearing, her massive form partially hidden by the shadows of the forest. The cubs were with her, their playful energy unmistakable as they tumbled over each other. Liam's breath caught in his throat as he watched them, his chest tightening with a mixture of joy and longing. The mother bear turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Liam raised a hand in a silent gesture, his lips curling into a faint, bittersweet smile. The bear huffed softly, her head dipping in what almost felt like acknowledgement before she nudged her cubs forward and disappeared into the forest once more. Liam stood there long after they were gone, the sun dipping lower in the sky and casting the forest in shades of gold and amber. The ache in his chest remained, but it no longer felt unbearable. The bears were where they belonged, and he knew, deep down, that he was where he belonged too. The morning the bears left, the forest was silent. The kind of silence that presses against your chest, forcing you to listen to things you'd rather not hear. Liam stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath visible in the crisp air, and watched as the mother bear lumbered toward the tree line with her cubs close behind. The cubs turned back a few times, their small faces peeking through the frost-laden branches, as if unsure whether to follow their mother or stay in the warmth they had grown used to. Liam didn't move. His hands hung limp at his sides, his fingers numb, not from the cold, but from the weight of what was happening. He had spent weeks pouring himself into their survival, weeks in which every thought, every action, had revolved around keeping them alive. And now they were leaving. It felt like losing Alice and Sophie all over again. Another family he had protected and loved gone. The mother bear stopped just before disappearing into the trees. She turned her head and looked at him, her dark eyes meeting his. It wasn't gratitude, not in the human sense, but there was something there, an acknowledgement, a connection. Liam's throat tightened as he stared back, his chest heaving under the strain of unspoken emotion. Then, without a sound, the bear turned and vanished into the forest, her cubs scurrying after her. For a long time, Liam just stood there, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots as he shifted his weight. The silence of the forest wrapped around him, suffocating and liberating all at once. He wanted to cry, to scream, to call them back, but he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the cabin, his steps slow and deliberate, like a man carrying something fragile. The cabin felt different now, empty, lifeless. The blankets the bears had slept on were still crumpled by the fire, their faint musk lingering in the air. The marks they had left, the scratches on the doorframe, the overturned pots, the paw prints on the floor, were reminders of their presence, and now, their absence. Liam sank into his chair by the fire, his eyes fixed on the smoldering embers. The silence was unbearable. For days, he drifted through the cabin like a ghost, aimless and hollow. The tasks that had once kept him busy, fetching wood, cooking meals, tending to the fire, felt meaningless now. Without the bears, the routines he had built around their care crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the vast, echoing void of his grief. It was worse than before, somehow. The bears had given him a purpose, a reason to get out of bed, and now that they were gone, he felt adrift again. But something was different this time. The emptiness didn't consume him as it once had. It lingered, yes, but beneath it was something else. A spark, a flicker of possibility. He thought of the bears, of the way they had clung to life despite the odds, of how they had fought to survive even in the face of brutal cold and injury. They had come to him broken and vulnerable, and he had helped them heal. It was a small thing, maybe, but it mattered. It had to. Liam began to move again, slowly at first, like a man learning to walk after years of confinement. He cleaned the cabin, scrubbing away the remnants of the bear's stay, but leaving the marks they had left on the walls and floors. They were scars, in a way, and like his own, they told a story. He found his camera, buried under a pile of old blankets, and turned it over in his hands. The leather strap was cracked, the lens smudged with dust, but it felt familiar, comforting. One morning, as the first hints of spring began to creep into the forest, Liam ventured outside with his camera slung over his shoulder. The air was still cold, but there was a softness to it now, a promise of warmth to come. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of damp earth and the first green shoots of new growth. He wandered aimlessly at first, his boots sinking into the slush, the weight of the camera unfamiliar after so many years. He found himself at the edge of the creek where he and Alice had once taught Sophie to skip stones. The water was still frozen in places, but a narrow stream trickled through the center, catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. Liam raised the camera to his eye, the motion instinctive, and snapped a photo. The click of the shutter startled him, breaking the silence, but it also stirred something inside him. It felt good, right? For the first time in years, Liam began to photograph the world around him. He captured the way the sunlight filtered through the bare branches, the way the snow clung to the jagged edges of the rocks, the way the forest seemed to breathe as it woke from its long winter sleep. Each photo was a step forward, a way of reclaiming the life he had lost. It wasn't easy. The grief was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, but it no longer controlled him. It was a part of him, yes, but it wasn't all of him. As the days grew warmer, Liam ventured further from the cabin, exploring parts of the forest he hadn't seen in years. He found himself drawn to the places he and Alice had loved, the places where Sophie had laughed and played. Each step was a confrontation with the past, but it was also a step toward healing. He began to see the forest not as a reminder of what he had lost, but as a testament to what he had loved. One afternoon, as he was packing up his camera after a long day of shooting, Liam heard a sound that made his heart leap. A low, familiar growl. He turned, his breath catching in his throat, and saw the mother bear standing at the edge of the clearing. Her cubs, now bigger and stronger, flanked her on either side. They stared at him for a long moment, their dark eyes meeting his before disappearing into the trees. Liam stood there for a long time, the camera forgotten in his hands. He didn't follow them. He didn't need to. Their presence was enough, a silent acknowledgement of what they had shared. He turned back to the cabin, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The seasons passed, and the forest changed around him. The snow melted, the trees burst into bloom, and the air grew warm and heavy with the scent of wildflowers. Liam changed too. He began to reach out, reconnecting with the people he had shut out for so long. He visited the town, selling some of his photos at the local market, and found that the act of sharing his work brought a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. The bears had left, but they hadn't taken everything with them. They had left him with something he hadn't thought possible: hope. Hope that even in the harshest moments, there was still beauty to be found. Hope that life, no matter how broken, could still be rebuilt. Liam wasn't the same man he had been before Alice and Sophie's deaths. He carried the scars of his loss, but he also carried the strength he had found in their absence. He had learned to live again, to find joy in the small, fleeting moments that made up the fabric of life. And though the pain would always be a part of him, it no longer defined him. As the sun set over the forest, casting the trees in a golden glow, Liam stood on the porch of his cabin and watched the world around him. The silence no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe, like he could move forward, like he could live.